Thank you. So, hope you are fine with last lecture because it might be tiring. I have not decided yet if I will be sitting or standing. We'll see. So this song, I think some of you heard it. So it's Simon and Garfunkel, and it's called "Bridge Over Troubled Water." And one of my still unpublished papers has this title, "Bridge Over Troubled Water," and it's something that also connects my previous research on Jewish migration and my current research on border rivers, because in both of researchers they have a lot of bridges over troubled water, and I will show you one of them in my presentation, a very nice postcard from the beginning of 20th century. Yeah, first of all, small explanation. So this lecture wasn't my idea because I'm quite skeptical about organizers placing themselves to the program. You know, at the conferences sometimes organizers doing themselves a keynote. You know, it's a huge compliment, but yeah, I'm skeptical about it. But when we discuss it and when we saw that several of you have some water environment topic, so I decided that it would be nice to also bring this topic as a topic of the lecture. And today we're gonna talk about border rivers and just rivers as well. We will start with a few rather theoretical things and things that are written about border rivers or just rivers around the globe, and then we will zoom in several times to find rivers bridge, and there I will show you a few cases that kind of correspond to this bigger picture that we are starting with. So we will start with this picture, which is not probably telling much, but it's part of the story, and our story starts in 1846 when Habsburg monarchy annexed free city of Krakow, and this place became very famous. Today it's middle of nowhere in Poland, but back then in 1836 it became Drei Kaiserhecke, so corner of three empires, where Czarna Przemsza was meeting Biała Przemsza and making River Przemsza going to the south to Galicia. And it's a very interesting place because, I mean, you see these postcards, you can imagine that there were some other publications, there were kind of myths of these three powers coming to the place, but still there is not many researches on these rivers, how they were used, were they used at all, and because this part is also not very well populated. We see some buildings on this postcard, but still it's not villages or cities next to the river, and if we use some other pictures, we see also borderline, like guarded borderline along the river. So I would say from natural perspective, it's good for the river to have border in this case because it's small river, and if it would be used a lot for different economical purpose, it would be not so good for ecological situation in this region. But it's very small example how very insignificant water course could become significant for very political, kind of strange reason, but still Drei Kaiserhecke was something recognizable in all three empires. And it brings us to one of the ideas of my today talks about interplay of water courses and big politics. We're gonna think about, hopefully together, about how water courses can challenge the politics, can challenge the geopolitical situation, but as well what this political, administrative border changes, all these days we are debating different contested changing borders, what they are doing to the nature and to the river in this particular case. That's map of Europe at the beginning of 20th century, part of Europe where we are. And here we have, so I mentioned already this border along Bela Przemsza. Here we have Zbruch. Here we have Prut that we have seen already when we were visiting this Romanian cemetery. And if we move to the interwar period, as addition to these borders, we have Dniester as a border, we have Cheremos as a border, and then to the east Tisa as well. So basically what I'm trying to say is that border river is not unique. Border river is not something that you should be surprised with. And even from ancient times, a lot of administrative lines, a lot of military lines were built a lot along the river, and it's a very logical thing to do because it's something that it's hard to cross immediately, right? It's something that protects you in some way. Mountains as well, but mountains is much harder to control, and because it's not flat, right? And river is flat, you can see what is happening on another side. But why we are talking only about modern history, it's because basically our nowadays understanding of the border comes to Europe somewhere after Napoleonic Wars, when finally these states that are deciding at the Congress of Vienna what to do with Europe, many of them are not receiving new borders, but they are establishing mechanisms, also international mechanisms, how to guard this border, how to protect this border, and border control became not just a burden of some military guys, but it's transformed into institution, and so on and so on. We know many stories, and some of you also are doing research on that, how border could be medical, how this administrative line could be military border or medical border or something else. We will briefly talk on three aspects that I'm usually addressing, and not only I myself, but generally that are usually addressed in regard rivers in terms of history. One is very old idea about history being a nature, being part of history, and of course we can mention here works of Brodel on Mediterranean Sea and many others, French author from this period, but also we have, so it's not a new, it's not a something contemporary scholars created, that nature is an actor of history. But honestly, there are not so many cases when we can prove that we really are capable to study it, because usually historians are not really skilled in hydrology, geology, even geography, and to study natural changes. For example, if we take a river, you need to look at centuries of properly conducted records about water level, about changes of water course, about use of the water, about fish migration. And if we are coming again to Eastern Europe, we basically don't have it. About most of the rivers, we don't have such records, which creates kind of challenge for us, but still there are many tries to do that. Here are the some famous books about rivers, and there are many of them about Amazon, Danube, Mekong, but also Columbia River, and many other. So it's kind of was a trendy thing, maybe not now, to write something as a river biography. It's written from many perspectives. Many things are written as eco-critical things. I would like to stop at these two books. So the one that is on your right, it's a book that we mentioned already several times by Constantin Avdeleanu, and I think, Lucian, you told me that you're reading it now, right?
Yeah.
What it's about?
It's about this first international organization that was created by different powers in order to regulate ship travel on the Danube River in this period.
Yeah.
And it was only meant to last 2 years originally, this organization, the Danube Commission, and it lasted some 80 years.
Yeah, no, that's right. It's about how Danube is the, as we I think mentioned it already during one of the presentations, that Danube was an opportunity, but also was a huge challenge for these greater powers around, and they were trying to manage it somehow. But when you have so many overlaps of economic and political interest, you need to cooperate over a river, and it's probably the most famous case in Central European history. But still, this research is very interesting example of this struggle, how river itself create a struggle for trade, for military sphere, for politics. Another book has nothing to do with Eastern Europe. It's about river Fraser or Fraser, I don't know how to spell it correctly, honestly, in British Columbia. And it's Fraser or?
It would be
Fraser,
Fraser.
okay, yeah. I did read the book, but still have no idea how to spell it properly. So this very interesting book about British Columbian River, about some kind of conflict between idea to make a dam along the river, to use it as a power source, and conflict with people who still believe that this river exists for fishing, because this river is one of the richest rivers in the world in terms of salmon population. And this book shows us how different actors are fighting over use of this river, and in the end fishing somehow won this struggle. But still, it's a very interesting case, which I would suggest you also, even if you don't interested in salmon and other things, just to read it as a very nice piece of environmental humanities, which brings you a lot of explanation how you could look at things, because it brings very interesting perspective of nature and its agency in the historical processes. Yeah, another thing is river as a contact zone. Some of you probably are familiar with the term contact zone by Mary Louise Pratt. Yeah, when her idea is that so cultural products were a contact zone that were kind of creating a contact between colonized South American lands and their colonizers in Europe. So basically literature became this contact zone. In my research, I use contact zone not only in this Pratt understanding of colonial knowledge transfer, but also in the understanding of social sciences, when contact zone is some kind of liminal space where different cultures, different nations meet, and it's usually happening, of course, on the borderlands. Here we have a book, a very recent one, on Volga. I think it's 2022. It's Oxford University Press, no, I think maybe it's a bit earlier. So it's during last few years it was published. It's Janet Hartley, and it's not exactly a book about river. It's rather a book about region around river. But what is she doing very well? Portraying Volga as a border between Islamic and Orthodox Russia, border between colonized people and colonizers, which is kind of controversial thing, but still in this case, and she's not paying, so as for my test, she's not paying enough attention to river itself, rather to population around, to political, historical process around, but still this idea of river is some kind of liminal space where different cultures or ethnicities or religious at a certain point met. It's also a very important perspective for me, and actually in this case as well, this point of view on rivers, it's also one of these ways to centered peripheries, because usually it's not happening in the middle of the empire, it's happening somewhere on the periphery, and if we look at these contact zones, it's always bring us totally different perspectives that we probably won't find in Moscow or Istanbul archives. And of course, with some of you we already discussed it over the last few days, that there are quite a lot of literature on imagination of rivers and imagination of riverscapes, something that might be called as eco-criticism. For blue humanities there is this term aqua-criticism to specify the focus. It's something quite well explored by literary scholars, not so well explored by historians, and it's obvious for you, right? I won't go into details, that when we are seeing rise of modern political projects and nationalisms, they are trying also to claim some space around. And of course rivers, of course mountains, sea coasts, and steppe and other natural objects are part of this mental picture that is intellectual or politicians are trying to create, trying to make this picture or this object kind of a reference point for idea. Let's call it political idea. It's not always national, not always something very ideological. And here there are two books. So blue one is Guido Gaussmann book about Mother Volga, and about Volga being kind of place of memory, place of identity, place of political ideas. Unfortunately, this book is not, it's not the recent one, but it's not very well known. I think it's because it was published, if I'm not mistaken, only in German, and yeah, maybe if it appeared in English it would be better known among scholars. But Guido Gaussmann actually is doing very interesting thing. He's not writing about the river, he's writing about empire coming to the river, and within this empire he is exploring how different groups, how different political actors are presenting this river. And another one is Riverscape's National Identity, about Shannon River in Ireland, and it's quite criticized book, and because the author Trisha Cusack did try to construct in this book a bigger picture. She added different cases, and Shannon River is only one of cases, and of course Shannon River is the strongest part of the book, and the rest is kind of based on some other researchers, not her primary research, and book was quite criticized, but I really like this book, and after this book, exactly after this book, I use riverscape as a term to describe landscape along the river, so basically space and scapes that belong to the river, that belong to both banks. When I present it to geomorphologists, they of course have different view what is riverscape, because they have quite different logic of space around the river. So basically all the basin of the river, in their view, it's riverscape. It could be very far from the river, so it's not so relevant for historians, because if it's far, it's less influenced. But still, I think you get the idea about river as imagined sink, river as contested object, as point of memory, and we will get to it also later, and there are many other interesting researches on that. Yeah, and something that I'm writing now, it's a biography of border river Zbruch. Does everyone know where Zbruch is? No, that's good, because I prepare an explanation. So yeah, it's research on border river that I approach as historicized nature. Again, we are coming back to Ratzel, Brodel, and others who developed this idea in the late 19th and first third of 20th century. And I look at this river exactly as an actor, as a contact zone, and as a riverscape. Riverscape in many senses, also riverscape of political presence and riverscape of memory. And I'm trying in this research combine sociocultural history, political history with environmental history, looking at late imperial and interwar period mostly. So, why Zbruch? Now, as you see, it's a river in between central and western Ukraine, we could say so. But if we come back to the history, here I would open the web page that I'll show you a bit later. So on September 17, 1939, we know the date, facilitated by Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact, Soviet army is entering interwar Poland by crossing river Zbruch, exactly here. And on that day, Soviet Union basically they are not only started occupation of Eastern Poland. They are not only entered the Second World War, but they also ended 167-year-long history of this Zbruch as a border river, because this river became a border between Habsburgs and Poland after first partition in 1772. Here you see Habsburgs. Here's no, we don't have Poland back then. It's rather a map, combination of different maps. I'll explain a bit later. And then it was, of course, border between Habsburg monarchy and Russian Empire. Then briefly between Western Ukrainian and Ukrainian People's Republics right after a Great War. And interwar period came, so it became border between Polish Republic and so then Polish Republic and Ukrainian People's Republic, and then Soviet Union and Polish Republic in the interwar period. And here you can see how many states are connected to this border. So we have Russian Empire, we have Austro-Hungary, we have interwar Poland, we have maps that are not, we already debated, are not quite political maps, but rather imaginary maps of Ukrainian People's Republic from 1917-1919, Western Ukrainian People's Republic. Here red, you cannot see it much, it's Soviet Ukraine, and it's all connected to this small, as for today, quite provincial river, and it makes this small water course quite significant. Even it was never navigated, it was never like a big river, how we would imagine it. And this region of Zbruch, prior to the Second War, was very much, as everything in Eastern Europe, was very much multi-ethnic, multi-language, multi-religious, and of course, during the 20th century, it became a scene for multiple regime changes, military conflicts, violence, mass atrocities. That, it's not a new thing for you, tears social fabric, radically harmonized linguistic and religious picture in the region. And today, as I mentioned, it's a very small river, left tributary of Dniester in between Ternopil and Khmelnytsky region. And all this complexity is very hidden, and I'm kind of trying in my project by combination of different approaches and sources to unpack it, to make it a bit more as a story of periphery, story of nature, story of contesting power over the border. Let me see what is here. Yeah, it's just the maps. You have seen it already. Yeah. So, and let's start with a river as an actor. So, Zbruch environmental history, as I told you about other rivers, is not very well documented. It's not. There are no proper records, but there is very interesting tendency that due to its border status, to many natural changes like floods, for example, there is state reaction, because each change of the water level, each flood affects the state border between two empires, and of course imperial centers somehow obliged to react. They not always, it's very visible from documents that not all of the bureaucrats really know what they are talking about, where are this place, but it's still something they are obliged to react, and actually cases that are driven by geomorphological changes, hydrological changes of the river, they are the most documented. And it's a bit strange dynamic when I don't see like everyday life of this water course. I see it only when something is happening, when something extraordinary is happening. And one of these extraordinary things happened in 1838, when it was very dry summer, almost without rains back then in East Central Europe, and water level went down quite significantly. And then something very bad for the local population happened, because at a certain point they start to see Pagan God coming from the river. They, of course, understood it as a punishment for, and there is press reports that local priests explained to them that you are not religious enough, and that the punishment, that's why you don't have a rain. And now these pagan gods are coming from the river, reminding us about our poor Christianity. But it was something that was left in the river, probably by those who were trying to make this region Christian. There are very different versions about that, but it's somewhere in between 9th and 11th century. So this god, statue of God, Shvetovid, Svitovid, world view. So God who has his faces facing all the sides of the world, was put it in the river. Of course, local landlord told that it should be somehow taken from the river, and for a few years it was just standing somewhere because no one really was there to touch it, because it's something pagan, something bad. But then it's quite well it's written story in Polish historiography. People from capital, people from Krakow learn about it. It became quite a significant story around the press, and they brought it to Krakow. Now it's in Krakow Museum. There are many copies around Poland and Ukraine. But also there is a lot of legends about that. There is a lot of beliefs about that among local population, and it was used for quite a long time by Greek Orthodox Church there as a reminder for local populations that you should really obey our traditions, because otherwise river can send us this pagan god. But it's just an example to show you when we see this natural change, right? When something like that happen, and when a river is by just living it's life, right? Because each year we have change of water level. But in this case, it was so extreme that it's created this kind of mystical cultural debates for centuries. Because still people in Husatin Regional Museum believe that one day they will claim the statue from Krakow Museum in Krakow because it's belonged to them. It's cultural heritage of their region. So it's still an ongoing case. We'll see what happened next in this long story. And of course, there is more known for us things as hydropower that came in the 20th century. And Zbruch was one of the rivers when Soviets start experiments with hydropower. And I'm not an expert on that, but when I spoke with people who are studying energy, all of them believe that, Ukrainian experts who know where is that and what is the place, all of them believe that the only reason to build this hydroelectric power station there was ideological one, because this river has no enough of resources to produce energy for this region, but this river is next to was right next to capitalistic Poland, and it was Soviet way to show the Soviet modernity, Soviet power, Soviet economic dominance. But by creating such a thing, they also changed the water course and something that probably today would be called as an ecological catastrophe happened, because river basically, not significantly, but changed its water course, and it of course affected nature around it on both banks. But I'm kind of fan of this case, because when Soviets built it, even it's not a good ecological thing, many inspectors, both from Moscow and Warsaw, came to the river to find out what is happening. They start writing long reports about that, and it's just an example of how river could be noticed by something happening with its nature. In this case, it's made by human or by state power. Another approach I mentioned is river as a contact zone. So I already mentioned these cases from Volga, but in case of Zbruch, it's also a very interesting story, because West Bank, Galicia, first Habsburg empires, then Poland, East Bank, Podolia, Russian empires, then Soviet Union, skipping all these short-lived states that I mentioned to you already after the Great War. And of course, this river is not just between states. It's river between Orthodoxy and Greek Catholics. It's river between dominance of Russian as official language and Polish, not very often, but also German language as a language of power. Even people who spoke Yiddish on both sides, it is in memoirs, they are remembering Yiddish speakers from other sides as kind of speakers of different Yiddish. Probably it was just some kind of regional dialects, but still it's in the memory. And the church part is very important. The church part is, I would say, crucial here. Very well studied earlier period. For example, one of recent Larivul's book about Greek Orthodox Church and partitions of Poland, he describes there how church property was split between states, and explain why Greek Orthodox Church was a problem for both empires in this region. Because for Greek Catholic Church, these new borders didn't have much sense. It was a problem for them, right? Because part of Greek Catholic population in 18th century left on Eastern Bank, and of course came under the Orthodox Church influence. But river was, of course, as you see in any city or village with the river, important part of the rural or urban scape. And when it became a border, it created even more problems because in small shtetl, you usually have one tzaddik if it's Hasidic shtetl, right? You usually have, if it's small place, you would have one synagogue. And it happened, for example, in Husiatin, which was split into two Husiatins, but one is like town and another is a small village. And all of the religious infrastructure remain on the West Bank. Of course, Russian Empire did build huge Orthodox church on the East Bank, but of course, no one thought that it's necessary to create Jewish infrastructure. And for many years, the bridge over Bruges in Husiatin, not this one, the bridge was kind of a place where tzaddik was allowed to come from Western Bank to meet this Eastern Bank population, and it was we don't have much sources on that, but I believe it was such a performance when the bridge that has two border checkpoints of huge, greatest power of this part of Europe, and it's all are ignored because it's a Jewish holiday, and tzaddik need to visit Jews on another bank. It sounds very interesting, but as I said, we don't have much sources to recreate the picture of it. This bridge, it's actually very well connected to a song I played at the beginning. So it's exactly bridge over troubled water, because when Jewish violence occurred in Volochysk, small town in western Podolia, it was only episode of Jewish pogrom in 1881 that occurred right on the border with Austro-Hungarian Empire, and Rivers Bruges became, and this bridge particularly became kind of bridge over troubled water for these Jews, because as far as they were allowed by Austrian border guard to cross the border, they were saved from the pogromists, because pogromists could not, of course, cross the state border. And River again played very interesting role, because when we are mentioning these things like crossing river over the bridge, we should understand that until 20th century there were only few bridges, and there were so many crossings, so many illegal and informal things, including water. And water was kind of space that was allowing this communication. And this border, there is many very well written books on this border as a state institution. So Beris Kutzmani, Paulus Außergruber, and many others did write story of this border as an institution. Unfortunately, they did not, I would say, they did not pay much attention to the river, but still they described this border as very informal one. So many crimes are happening there, so many illegal things are happening there. And all the migrations we are describing as a great happened basically, huge part of them happened at this border. And as we know, most of this migration were not documented by empires, because it was such a shade zone for both empires. But we are going further, because I see that I'm speaking already for 40 minutes, okay. We mentioned imagination, and mentioned already Guido Gaussmann with his research on Volga, and Teresa Cusack with Shannon, and how nationalism and empire could create this interplay with the river. And Bruges is extremely significant. Where honestly, each time when I'm presenting at the conference, it doesn't matter. I could speak about fishing, I could speak about Gusat and Stadik. There is a person in the room who asked me, so, is this river still a cultural border between Western and Eastern Ukraine? So because they heard it somewhere in the 90s, they heard it somewhere in diaspora, it was, I wouldn't say strong, but still quite significant idea for some period, for some groups of intellectuals, that there is kind of phantom border along this river. And here, of course, it was even included to this German project, Phantom Grenzen, where they were debating former borders, how they influence electoral practices, values, economic behavior, or something else. This project was very much criticized, and Zbruch somehow, I've seen it in the description of the project, but it never came to the results. Probably they didn't find someone to prove that it's any kind of phantom border in any sense. But of course, there are scholars who see this difference. For example, those who study collective memory, they see this difference, but it's not connected to the border itself. It's rather connected to longer presence of Soviet regime on the eastern bank, and of course, to the western bank it came much later. If we are speaking about Zbruch, we have several narratives that could be found not only in sources, not only in the literature, but also in the internet, in many forums. So there is idea of Zbruch as a river that divide the Ukrainian nation, and its idea that was kind of articulated already at the last third of 19th century, but it was mentioned even before, at the first half of 19th century. So many of Ukrainian nation builders mentioned this in some way. I don't see so far like person who would write a clear narrative for it, but many names you could heard about, like Boris Hrynchenko, Ivan Franko, Mykola Mikhnovsky. So Ukrainian nationalists from the late 19th, early 20th century, they were saying that Ukrainian nation is divided by this river, and we will see a bit in a few minutes what happened with this idea in the 20th century. Of course, then for Soviet Union, it was frontier of communism, because especially early Soviet Union, they really believed in spreading proletarian Marx and Lenin's ideas through their borders, and this border was their western border with capitalistic Poland, which was seen as an enemy in many senses, but in ideological sense as well. There is some of you who are familiar with Polish narratives or have some connection with Poland, have heard about Kresy, have heard about Galicia generally being kind of eastern boundary of Polish nation, civilization, states, whatever. And of course, Zbruch is presented there, Zbruch as a eastern frontier of Poland, but sometimes we could find in the literature that it's kind of old idea of Zbruch kind of bordering Polish nation, but that's not true, because when a Polish government brings their map to peace conference in Paris, they dreamed about much bigger Poland to the east, and Zbruch was internal river, and this idea of Zbruch as the eastern border was created already by Polish intellectuals after the war, kind of as a nostalgic thing, nostalgic way of remembering interwar Poland as a great state. And we know there is no researchers, but there are sources that I hope one day made into this scholarship, sources on traumatic memory, spatial memory on this region, and environmental memory. When I'm saying that there is no researchers, there are of course big scholarship on how, let's say, events of Holocaust remembered in this region. There is huge scholarship on Polish history and how it is being remembered or how it's presented in memory politics, but there are not so many scholars who try to look at the environmental part of the story. There is not so many scholars who try to look at the river as a reference point. For example, Itzhak, so oh my God, how to say Itzhak in English? Memory book or community memory book? How usually? Itzhak book. Memory book, yeah. So memory book of Jews from Skala even has a title, Skala on the Zbruch. And if you read this book, you see that Zbruch is the only reference point for these people to create a narrative on this area, to create and this co-living with the river is very strong there. I mean, river sometimes even more present than the surrounding nation in this book, because it was very important for their everyday practices, especially when they describe economic life. River is always there. It's not only imagined thing, not only like reference point for your memory, but also it's just a source for your economic activity. And there are more sources and things that I hopefully one day would build into some picture of how Zbruch as a natural object is remembered by these displaced communities, by communities that somehow related to this region. And in the remaining time, I would like to show you a few examples. So as I promised at the beginning, we are zooming in many times, because we were looking at the empires, and now we will go further along this Zbruch, mostly from north to south, and we will look on what happened with this river, but not as a natural object, but as an imaginary line in the interwar Soviet Union. The next few slides and some points that I'll bring after it, it's part of the paper that is already, so it should be published in the end of this year or it's beginning of next year by an Environmental Humanities journal, and it's part of issue on aqua criticism from historical and literature perspective. And here I'm looking at the Zbruch, not Zbruch as a river and riverscape around Zbruch as politically instrumentalized space and ideologically instrumentalized image. Before we move to it, so just to remember something that I was telling you 45 minutes ago. So the Great War finished. There are Ukrainian National Republic, Western Ukrainian National Republic, Polish-Soviet War. So a lot of disaster and conflicts happening in this region. But then border basically restored. Border was restored. It's new border between maybe, yeah, this map would be helpful for us. So it's new border between, it's right here, between Soviet Ukraine or Soviet Union and Poland. For understanding of the dynamic in this region, we need to say that for several years this border was not functioning properly. So even it sounds strange, because there was border infrastructure quite well developed by two empires, and then finally, after many conflicts in the region, two new greater power in the region established border at the same line, but they really struggle to control it. They really struggle to understand how people flows are working there, what are the economic connections, what are how to control the river, why there are only few bridges there, and how generally how do we work there in many senses. And it's, as I mentioned, none of these governments were happy with this line as a border, because Soviets have seen their power much further to the west, and Poles, Dmowski line was a few hundred kilometers to the east, and it's not ideal border for both of them, and it's created a lot of tension and competition in the region. And actually now we will look at how this competition works, at least on Soviet side. Just last remark that also there are some research on that this beginning of Soviet power in this region also was associated with both in Poland and Soviet Union with as a region of criminal, region of informality, illegality. It's kind of wild east and wild west for both of them in many senses. And it also finds a lot of representation in imagination about the river. Let's try and check connected sound here. Maybe I can just change it. Or I can do something what previous lecturer was doing. We'll use a mic to play. We'll see if it works. Let's see. So I'll show you just a minute from the. So let me start. So here you see movie Освобождение, Liberation. It was created in 1930, so basically late 1939 and in 1930 by very famous, one of the most famous Ukrainian film director, Oleksandr Dobzhenko. He was traveling, following first Red Army troops and then different newly established bureaucratic institutions around around Eastern Galicia, documenting how this newly liberated part of Ukrainian Soviet Republic looks, and he produced this movie. People who study Dovzhenko's biography trying to create an excuses for them that he was not really happy with it, but it was kind of assignment after which he was promised to work on something that he really liked to do, some funny movies about Cossacks or something like that. But he created this piece, very interesting one, at least for my taste. And what should we skip verification? Maybe I should, yeah, let's try to do it with the mic because, and so on for 1 more hour about capitalistic Poland, Ukrainian slaves of Polish landlords. So for those of you who are not so good in Russian, just in short explanation, so it's about this deep old river that's full of tales and history that divide two nations, and then this Polish defense line, they are making, so the narrator, Dovzhenko itself, making fun of it, saying it's a Polish version of Maginot, which is not successful because landlords have stolen all the money, and then there's, so he's saying Pany, and then he's showing parts, just rural parts of eastern Poland, saying that look at this poor image Ukrainian slaves, Polish landlords, and such things. And here he switched to Ukrainian, which sounds even a bit better than his Russian, because his Russian has this quite strong Ukrainian accent. But now we're gonna discuss how we came there, because early Soviet Union, of course, as you know, there was looting in many republics, and there was this try to play with national feelings of all, or population of all of the republics, different populations of these republics. But still, we cannot say that they were really fans of promoting Ukrainian nation as a greater one in the region. And here we see opposite thing. So we are crossing the river, and here is again Ukrainian nation. And this very interesting reference, probably some of you also pointed it to the cross, and then he mentioned Jesus Christ in this poetry. It's also kind of their way to address Galician Ukrainians, who are by 1939 much more religious than Ukrainians in Soviet Union, due to reasons you all know. So how such movie happened, how such pictures came to play, because there were no much cinemas, like nowadays one in Soviet Union, but this movie was, I don't know actually proper word in any language, when military guys were carrying this projector and showing propaganda movies in the villages. I don't know how this device called in English as well, but I think you know what I'm talking about. So it's kind of cinema equipment that you can bring from village to village to this house of culture to show this movie, and it was shown all around Soviet Ukraine to explain what's happening, but also to create knowledge of what we liberated. Where is it? Like, it's ours. You should believe that it's ours. Look, yeah. We are coming back to the 20s. Here it's 1926, and it's newspaper Червоний кордон, Red Border, that was published in Kamenets-Podilsky, which was administrative border of the Podolia province at this period. In my research, I'm looking at central newspapers, key newspapers, and local newspapers to see how they describe the river, and there I see very clearly this image of frontier of communism, frontier of people who are liberated from capitalism, frontier of this great Soviet power that we should overcome to liberate further nations. And it's, of course, Moscow newspapers are mostly writing about world revolution, and they are not bothering so much with mentioning Zbruch, because no one in Moscow would know where is that. Like, it's not a point for them, but they are very well promoting idea of international proletarian unity, struggle against Western capitalism, etc., mentioning the border. But each newspaper that is getting closer to the border, we see more and more references to the river itself, because probably for people in Kamenets-Podilsky is already a huge natural object. They know its reference point, and there we already see a portrait of Zbruch, the last Red River, even was written in these Червоний кордон newspapers. And in the 1930s, when Stalin plans to expand his power in Eastern Europe, expand his territory of Soviet Union, start to grow. In 1930s, we see very interesting tendency when somehow colonization is over. So routining policy is already being almost stopped. Schools are switching from Ukrainian to Russian, or from Yiddish, Bulgarian, German to Russian. But at this party level, at the newspapers level, they are promoting idea that there is Western Ukraine, because Ukrainians are living there as well, and it's kind of contradicting to what they do in educational sphere, etc. But still, they are starting promote this idea officially in the propaganda about Western Ukraine, Western Ukrainians, and basically starting from this period, from 1930s, we have like precedent of mass use of these terms, because before it was something that some intellectuals would mention in their writings, and idea very well disseminated in Soviet propaganda, but also in cultural products. Those of you who studied Russian literature or culture know Babel's Konna Armia, and it started with chapter from novel that's called Переход через реку Збруч, so crossing the river Збруч. Literature scholars, and so many of them, for example, the last with whom I had this discussion is Anastasia Simferovska from Northwestern University. She's finishing dissertation on Babel and other Soviet authors as interplay of Jewish and other identities. So she's finishing this work now, and in one of her papers she pointed out, so here you see places where Babel wrote, or about which Babel wrote Збруч novel, and here is Збruch, because a Bolshevik army went to Warsaw. Not here, they were not targeting any of these provincial towns and cities, they went to Warsaw. So most likely Babel never crossed this Збруch as an army man. And Anastasia, whom I mentioned, suggests that it was about river Sluch, which kind of sounds similar. It's somewhere here in Zhytomyr region, and it's so her argument is that it was Babel play, kind of Babel mystification to describe overcoming of Soviet border. I'm not sure if Babel was so aware about Sluch and Збруch, and so Babel was aware, but I'm not sure if it was about crossing the river Sluch, or it generally was some kind of metaphor by Babel. But it's all just important for us to know that it's created image. So there was no Babel as a part of Soviet troop crossing this river. But this image is created, and this book, published in 1927, was republished so many times. It became one of the book with with biggest number of copies in the interwar Soviet Union, and after war as well. It was a huge part of Soviet literature, and for a long period in the Soviet school program, of course, there was only first novel, crossing the river Збруч. This kind of cultural production was important, but still not enough for Soviet authority to prove their power there over this region, and to justify their intent to overcross this river. And in the 1930s, so basically a period that I'm talking about when this transformation is happening, they start to build cultural infrastructure along the river, on the river. Before we look at this cultural infrastructure, I just would like to mention that there were not similar, but quite similar processes on Polish side, because Poles were also thinking about having some influence on Christians, mostly Poles and Ukrainians, on other bank, on Eastern Bank, and Polish government was struggling with protecting rights and keeping connection with Catholic population of Soviet Union. There were a lot of international disputes about rights of Catholic population on the east bank of Збруch as well. On the Polish side, in Warsaw, I found very interesting projects. They plan to build huge Catholic church next to the Збруch, and they write openly that the idea is to show that on this side of this Збруch we are Christians, and there you are oppressed for your religion. They never did build it, so there is no evidence how it should. So there is image not very clear how it should look, but it should be something really spectacular. They didn't build it, didn't managed to finish it, maybe because of the war, but Zbruch still became a part of Polish cultural tradition. This is a book already republished in early 90s, I think, so it's copy I have, but original is 1938, and it's very popular picture of Zbruch. So it's a story about young man coming, I don't remember from Warsaw or Krakow, so from big Polish city, coming to the periphery, and as far as he get engaged with Zbruch, some dark side of him appeared. He is involved in smuggling, he is contacting different gangsters, sex workers, doing some many illegal things, watching people doing these illegal things, etc. And we see how Zbruch portrayed it here, very sexualized female character, but also that's supposed to show us wildness of this place. And it's very popular image in Polish culture in the 30s, which also kind of a bit contradictory with the state idea of spreading their influence and Catholic power to the east. But let's come back to Soviet Union. So we are moving, so we've seen this bridge in Podvolochisk, now we are moving to the south, closer to Dniester, and all of these regions along the east bank, most of them are very small villages. Most it's just few streets villages, but Soviet Union, Soviet government decided to create really significant cultural infrastructure along the river. Here, for example, we see its house that, of course, in the imperial time was house of landlord, of nobleman in the area, in Tarnaruda. They turned it into house of culture and then to the school. And it's very interesting that, so here in the map you see the center of village is somewhere here, but this cultural object appear here, and here it's really flat area, so it's facing the river. Same thing here, Ivankivtsi, it's a very small village, but this is a house of culture, and then also school built in 1934, 1935. Lenin was added later, and he is not there anymore until recently, but still, again, small village with this modernist building, and building, you can guess what building is doing, it's facing the river, facing the border. And we can see 5 or 6 these houses of culture in small villages along the Zbruch, and of course the military infrastructure developing. This is a reconstruction in Volochisk, but they are building Stalin line also along the river, and military historians are saying that the Stalin line, so it wasn't a prospective project, but still the idea was to show this power. And what is the reason of building this defense line on the hill on the border when it's basically observed, this construction site was observed by border guards of your enemy, potential enemy, right? And it's Stalin line also was a manifestation that we are kind of have military power against you. And of course, my favorite case, it's Husiatin. As I mentioned, Eastern Bank, so Western Bank remained a town, and Eastern Bank was just a village of Husiatin. It was splitted in late 18th century. On Soviet time, they are in the 1930s. They are building this colonnade. Soviet newspapers called it arch. I don't know why it's arch. It's colonnade, but here inscription is not very visible. They had probably not so good cameras as we do nowadays, but it's written there: "Комунізм змете усі кордони." Communism will sweep away all boundaries. And I cannot describe it in words, but if you stand there, there is very small river. A bit to the hill on other side there is relatively small town, very small village, and like nothing. It's just river and nothing, and this colonnade is standing next to the river. From next picture you will see how close it to the water. And if you do not know the meaning of that, why it's there, it's like, when these people who went somewhere as a labor migrant and then coming back home and they're building something huge just to show off in front of their neighbors that they brought this money from Italy or something like that, and it doesn't make any sense there. But they did build this colonnade. They changed also a few times this inscription. At a certain point it was proletarian of all nations should be united, something like that. And this place became, so you see it's basically next to the river. This place became, it's very micro case, it's very small thing, but this place became very important for establishing Soviet narrative in this region, for bringing this idea of crossing the river. Any ideas why it's 1954? What they are celebrating there with? So if you don't see it's marked.
You can probably it's 100th century of added. It's 64.
Yeah, it's 54. Yeah, it's 54. Yeah. So here is Marx. Here is Lenin. Here is this canonic picture of Soviet liberating soldier kissing this Western Ukrainian peasant, male peasant, wearing vyshyvanka. It was a very famous picture. And here we have two dates, very important for Soviet narrative. This is 1939, and this is 1954. 54 is 300th anniversary of great unity of Ukrainian nation with Moscow Tsardom, and 1939 is already moment when Soviet power unify Ukrainian nation. And we see this celebration as a kind of one narrative, this series of unification, but how it was allowed in late 30s Soviet Union. You all know about people being shot for producing culture in Ukrainian, for being Ukrainian writers, all the Stalin repressions, and such things are happening. And of course it's 54, but the image already created in late 30s. I really like argument that done first by Simon, but then very developed by Kaiserhecke, that in Soviet Union was only one great nation, of course Russian one, but for a very short period, basically from 1939 till the end of Second World War, Soviet authorities allowed another great nation to exist within Soviet Union, and it's great Ukrainian nation. And in this case, great nation means nation that goes beyond its borders. And Ukrainian nation in Soviet understanding, in Soviet propagandistic understanding, was going beyond these borders, and as we show from this movie, it was their way to explain why they should own Western Ukraine, as they called it in the movie. Back then it was a very new term, Western Ukraine, and same goes for Western Belarus. This liberation movie actually completes the puzzle of all these strange things built there, and Zbruch, which is in this story, is not very, that doesn't have much of agenda, but still is extremely important symbolic space, and it shows us also, we see evidence from later period when in Soviet Union, especially in Soviet Ukraine, very small internal river was quite known. It was in literature, also in movies, because it was symbol of this liberation, of this unification of great nation. Somehow its nation stopped to be great a few years after, when it was not relevant for Soviet authority, but still these strange objects are still there. It's my pictures I did in 2017, I think. Yeah, so you can now they use it to mark administrative border between regions, because I mean, what else you can do with this thing? But you can see surroundings, and yeah, that's really ridiculous, especially now. But to conclude about the last part about this ideological use of the river, we in this paper I mentioned, I'm doing, and my argument is that Zbruch, actively presented in Soviet press and literature publication from middle 20s, river is entering these cultural and political discourses. At first, we have very strong idea of frontier in economical and political sense, but with Polish imperialism, of course, this idea is slowly transforming to this statement that it is a frontier of communism. Simultaneously, Soviet Union utilized, expanded, and instrumentalized the idea of Ukrainian nationalists from previous period about the unity of Ukrainians on both sides of this bridge, and this instrumentalization of idea of a nation divided by a river and its combination with discourses of struggle against the capitalism in the West made Zbruch River one of the key symbols of Soviet ideology in Ukraine in the 30s, especially, as I mentioned already, in 1939-44, when it became a symbol of unification of great Ukrainian nation. And the transformation of eastern bank of Zbruch confirm argument about that exist for decades in Soviet in Soviet studies. One of the most known is Sabine Dulin, about Soviet authorities creating showcases of communism, and this special analysis. I show you some examples of it with these pictures. Special analysis of transformation allow us to explore micro level of Soviet propagandistic program, as well as examine region as a instrumentalized riverscape, which is clearly here. So I elaborated on this case more than on environmental and more than environmental and sociocultural one, which we mentioned at the beginning, just to give you some local perspective. I see that we have barely 12 minutes for questions. Sorry, my idea was to give you more time, but yeah, I hope you have some.
First of all, thank you. This is so interesting, such an interesting topic and presentation. I feel like I'm thinking just question in a way that you have mentioned, as far as I understood, this is a river which experienced different kind of border regimes. Sometimes it was closed, sometimes it's now open, and as far as I understood, it previously was a frontier. Now did it manage to transform from frontier into a borderland? In that way that what kind of practices are there, and to what extent, because when you have a river as a border, when you have a closed border regime, it kind of neutralizes border, while borders are not natural, they are constructed. And my question is, when this was a closed border, to what extent there was a possibility to transcend this border, cross the river, and disobey the regulations and rules? And the follow-up question, building up actually by Soviet Union. Was it a kind of exercise in order to strengthen, make people rigid the border and as a barrier for people to cross the river, I don't know, or to regulate the space more? So, yeah, this is just random thoughts.
Yeah, thank you. So, yeah, I'm just returning to this map that I showed. We can normally call it map because it's a combination of different things. It's something that I want to mention, but forget about it. It's a web page that I, together with my colleague Olena Palko, we created it a few years ago and still developing. It's called Shadows of Empires. So far, it's digital projection of European borders, real, imagined, and wartime borders. Our idea is to develop it into a platform where you can upload some more research to. Here I use pin option and pin for you Republic of Poland 1930, Soviet Union 1930, Ukrainian Soviet Republic, it's 28. What else? So Western Ukrainian Republic, Austro-Hungary, Ukrainian People's Republic, claimed version, and Zbruch is here. Why I'm mentioning that? Zbruch is here, border of everything basically. It's easier sometimes to say it's border everything in Eastern Europe, you know, that mentioned all of these. And I can think about period when it was like 100% closed. So of course, Soviet Union tried to do it. They were guarding borders properly, starting from late 20s. But still, for local population, at least until, along all the history of border, it never was a real barrier, because first of all, it was somehow allowed for some parts of the population to cross it for different reasons, like mixed marriage, over border marriages, different trade things, etc. But also, as I mentioned, river was such a great place for informal practices. So, for example, not only printings in Ukrainian, nationalistic printings in Ukrainian that were forbidden because of ban of Ukrainian language in Russian Empire, was brought through the river, but also Iskra newspaper was published in Europe and bring through the same river to brought to the same river through the Zbruch. And I mean, informality there is a big thing, including migration and smuggling. As for regulations and attempts to close it, of course, very significant period is period of famine, of Holodomor, when Soviets tried to prevent economic exchange between population on East Bank with population of Poland. Fishing was prevented back then, and also it one of these genocidal practices, and but still they did not succeed. I mean, still people were there in oral history records. We know this. We know about the stories how people are crossing the river to exchange their clothes for food, for example, during the famine. This border development is a long story. I won't go there, but it never was closed properly, and it always, even if it was closed, there was always space for some illegal moment in it. And your second question was?
HPP's hydropower plant, is this still functioning?
Oh yeah.
And because it's also about showing expression of power, power over nature, or controlling, and gives you tools to control the territory, and dominate the nature with modernity narrative.
Yeah, what they did, they of course changed the water course, they screwed ecology a bit in the region in the 30s. It never was a powerful power plant, and it was very quickly closed after the war, when they created much more important objects of, to produce energy. There was a try, I don't know, 7, maybe 8 years ago, to somehow renew it. But what the people who try, I think it was kind of combination of experiments of enthusiasts and also idea to create somehow heritage site, some kind of heritage site there. But what they discovered, it is producing such small amount of power, so we need more power to run it, yeah, it doesn't make much sense. But I mean, in the 30s, needs of energy, of course, were very small, so it still probably had some sense to build it. Yeah. Oh, sorry. So I think there are a few hands before. Yeah.
Thank you for your lesson. It is a really interesting research, and I would like to ask you about the period before between two world wars, because it looks like people who lived on the eastern bank of the river paid more attention to this physical and symbolical border. You described cases with colonnade, with names of newspapers, yes, border, and other manifestations. But what about people from Galicia's bank? Did they create something the same or not?
Okay. Let's maybe collect, because I know short answer to this one, and let's maybe collect a few questions.
I had two kind of related questions. Were about wider imaginations of the river. So you mentioned briefly about some interest in people who remember the river who have moved far away from the region, like Jews who live in the United States or Israel, or Ukrainians who live in the United States or Canada, who remember this river in a certain way. And also kind of within the wide image of the river, did you find any comparisons of the river to other rivers? Like, for example, where you say like the Bruch is like the Rubicon or something, and then for this reason, so the Bruch is like this other river. And so then when did you find these examples, and did you see any patterns in the way that the river was compared to other rivers in history or in other spaces?
Yeah, I think I'm gonna answer that because Steven gonna ask me something comprehensive probably. So yeah, as I mentioned, Poles had this, and yeah, it's not about people, it's about state projects. And I have no proof that people cared at all about this colonnade or something else. Probably it was something interesting for them, but if they were influenced, I have no idea, and yeah, I don't know how to prove it or or argue with it. But yeah, Polish authorities, as I mentioned, they were planning this few church projects on the river. First of all, is to show Catholic power. Yeah, because there is quite a lot of literature on that, on international disputes about repressions against Catholic priests in Soviet Union, and generally Polish government was very much concerned with condition of Polish population in this region on the Soviet side of the river. So of course it was a part of propaganda, if we call it that. Of course, in Polish political discourses, we have this idea that these Poles somehow belong also to our state. But we don't see this kind of cultural infrastructure or something like that on the other side. Or at least maybe I haven't found it yet. It also might be an explanation. About the memory, so even if I pretend so, I'm not memory scholars, not a literature scholars. I knew nothing about memoirs. I treat it all as historical sources. And to tell this story, to create a narrative, a biography of river and biography of its population and states connected to this river, I need this after story to be there, because it's very important from my point of view, and of course it's comparable. There is researches on Oder, how it's remembered in Polish and German way. There is researchers many things on Danube, on Jordan as a contested rivers. It's very comparable, but yes, you mentioned I mostly rely on diasporal communities that somehow documented this memory, and why it's in many cases Jewish communities, because as you know, in the United States it was part of building this infrastructure of diasporal minorities institution, writing their history, that what happened to their families before migration, right? So that's why in Jewish narrative it's very much presented, yeah.
And in Ukrainian narratives?
In Ukrainian narrative we will see also this Bruch dividing river in diaspora, but also, I mean, there are memories about the region, but in Ukrainian diaspora they are very much preoccupied with this national frame of international relations, Soviet power coming, interethnic relations, Soviet power coming, etc. So we don't see much of references to natural objects, but Bruch is there as dividing river, you know, as something like that, yeah. Stephen, you wanted to ask something?
I keep thinking, Oleksii, that thanks for such a rich presentation with all these multiple narratives, that there's this line from Baba that I really love, where he describes the orange sky coming out like a severed head. And to me, it's always that question, a larger question about violence, but specifically in context from where he came from, Moldova, and also within the context of the Odessa stories. It's a larger commentary about the nature of modernity, or multiple modernities, and that long stretch from, say, in Soviet Jewish writing and in Russian Jewish and Ukrainian Jewish writing from the 1880s up until, say, his death in the 1940s. I mean, in some ways we're kind of stuck in that mental map, or maybe in that framework where we're going on a transition journey, which is exactly the metaphor of a river. If you're going up, down, north, south, east, west, whatever it might be, Danube, Volga, Mississippi, Nile, something like that, right? Crossing the River Jordan, there's kind of like that story of transformation when you're stepping over into something and you're searching for a way to step over it while maintaining yourself. And I think that in many ways it is still the persona or the masks and the characters that come out of Babel's stories. And in many ways I kind of see like the metaphor of crossing rather than say building or destroying, like what would be for Crimea or, you know, for other places, let's say. I see us as kind of like Babel's children. And I guess, you know, like, I can have this transform into a cliche, like we're all coming out of Popel's overcoat, but in some ways, the landscapes that are created out of the stories can't get away from that bridge metaphor, or they can't get away from that particular landscape. And I guess I'm wondering if you could maybe answer what's the way out of that trap, because the bridge is built, right? And there are people on both sides of the bridge, so like there are bridges, it's not destroyed, it's still exceptionally important, as you show from Hisyapin, which is a really great story. Like, what's the alternative framework if it's not a journey of self-transformation? Because the river becomes the self. Like you're giving a biography of someplace, like the church put the crown on her head, and that someplace becomes the story of modernity, which is very violent. The orange sky like a severed head.
Yep.
And the severed head, I guess, in some ways, it's the Soviet. Sorry, that's Baba quote.
I agree with you about this transcendental idea of crossing of the rivers, how change you, right? How expand what you're doing. But one way to overcome it is to look at micro level when crossing the river is not an event. Crossing the river is a multiple everyday practice. When river, so river space owned by community of both banks disregarding the border. And I mean, for Moscow, for Bubbles narrative, of course, it's overcoming the river. But if you look at the micro level, I mean, not so much. And even nowadays, we have many villages along the river that communicate with each other without the bridge. We have, small boats. In many places, you can walk through the river, especially after the dam built in Satanev. So, and it's became more complex because this crossing doesn't mean some radical move. It's something that you do every day. But also,
would be the ordinary.
yeah, it's like moving back and there. But also, I very much see your point about so something should happen when great power cross it, right? Something should happen after.
It was instrumentalized.
Yeah.
Especially Ukrainian nation.
And that's what we also can see from micro level, that it's, so for example, ethnic homogenization. It's happening, but it's not just because someone crossed the river. It's the processes where this crossing is just symbolic act. It doesn't change much for the people itself. There is bigger processes and there is bigger mechanism, and in such micro studies, sorry for bringing you to such detailed, I know that it's not always interesting when you are not familiar with the region to look at these small villages, but this geopolitical change very often seen as internal things there if we look at what have people to say. And there is another internal, so micro level dynamic, which is not about crossing, which is not event for them. So pogrom in Volochyska, I mentioned 1881, for Viennese newspapers, crossing the bridge, it's escaping violent barbarian empire for these Jews who are coming from Volochyska to Podvolochyska. And that's what, for example, Neue Freie Presse write in Vienna. But then they are really confused, these corresponders, because next day these people are returning back to pick up their belongings, and then they're coming again and coming back. And it's something that you cannot explain from Vienna, because if you saved Jews from being persecuted by barbarian empire, why next morning they're coming back? It's so I think my answer here is micro level, which show complexity very much. Yeah, I think.
But there's a confusing question in my head, but I try to formulate because if I understand right, the river can be a context, but what is the context for river? And if the answer is all, field, mountains, people, fish, animals, and other, what it means? And who are the environmental historians now? Because in my imagination, historians many decades try to avoid from grand narratives. But today it means that all environmental historians are epigons of Brodel and other creators of total history. What do you think about it?
Actually, I mean, we all are trapped by Brodel. I mentioned him for some reason several times, but sorry. Yeah. But I mean, for such cases as this kind of combination of political, social, cultural history in modern Eastern Europe, Brodel is not working very well because. Brodel is longue durée. Brodel is about very fundamental changes that are happening not because Soviets decided to cross something, And Brodel's idea, and if we look not at environmental historians, but at environmental science, this 30, 50 years history, it's nothing for them. if we are speaking about natural objects. So to study river, you need to, as I said at the beginning, follow at least few hundred years, quite detailed reports, what is happening, what kind of fish we have there, what is water level. And here, I think Bordel is useful as a point of view, but his idea of this longitude is not very applicable. I'm thinking rather about Kozelek and his approach of multiple temporalities when he challenged existing periodizations, when he challenged ideas that something is happening in one day or in 1 year, that there's this bifurcation points. He's very skeptical about that. Now he's being criticized for that a lot, but still looking at the object, natural one, allow us to challenge this temporality we have in our heads, that there is some Soviet Union, Russian Empire, another empire coming somewhere. If we, of course, for telling political side of the story, instrumentalization, it's important thing. But if we go from another corner, if we look at the villagers, fishers in the river, it's not their periodization of history. I mean, okay, something is changing, it's affecting them. Their kids could learn another language next year in the school, but it's not about this bifurcation point. And if we are speaking from nature perspective, we cannot speak from nature perspective. But we are trying to take this side of natural history. It's very hard for us historians to make any kind of logic in any kind of periods, because it's not about historical events. It's not about Molotov-Ribbentrop agreements or something like that. But Brodel is still important. Brodel is, something under us, showing us a good example how to deal with it, how to create this interplay between history and nature. The big problem of Bordel is his kind of focus on centers. He's always trying to find center of the network, some hubs. And if we are looking at the empires, most of us do that, we find much more beneficial to look at the peripheries, to know how it works there, not follow the center's ideas. But yeah, I agree with you that it's very multi-contextual, and I'm very skeptical about my capability to cover all these contexts in this project. Yeah, so I totally agree.
I'm just wondering, have you come up with a structured plan already for your book? And if you have, any difficulties in composing a book based on a river? Any comments on chronological or thematic as a structure? Sorry, it's a very precise question.
Yeah. I just thinking,
if
you don't mind that we are using more time that we promised for this thing. So yeah, as I mentioned, idea is chronological journey, which is combined with journey along the river, which could be achronological, but it's quite. So far, it's quite stereotypical one. So we start with history, we end with history, and we have border life and after border life. I won't have any pre-border life because for this I need to be medieval or early modern historian, which I'm not. Yeah, this idea of journey along the rivers that show us different transformation caused by political regime change, and on the other side, changes caused by the river itself, which is not very visible from Moscow or from Vienna, but it is very visible if we look at these sources of this ordinary people that happen to live on one or another bank. Yeah. I won't expand on it. We can talk privately, because I think.
It's a really good comment. I like the Kozelek comment, because that really, it works for you, I'm sure, very well, because also he has the thing sediments of time, which exists at the bottom of the river as well. So it's like a really great thing, and it helps to also, what we were talking about earlier, explain these multiple meanings of all the parts of the river. So you have the river itself has multiple meanings from different places, and if you look at a micro level on this daily rotation of time, it looks very different than the armies that are coming. And then you have the bridge, which can be crossed and manifests changes, but also from a different perspective, you build a stone bridge and manifests like solidity and things. And then it's like referencing like the Balkan literatures of like Ivo Andrić, Bridge on the Drina and Isma Kadere. You have like all these stories of bridges meaning like we're trapped in history and nothing changes. So I think it's cool. It's a cool theoretical link to that.
Oleksii, you need to tell it from the perspective of a fish.
That's my dream, to find more sources on fish. Because I think I mentioned that already, that there is this great research on Danube fish migration based on, in 19th century, based on records from Viennese fish markets. And it's really great thing, but I'm struggling with sources there. So.
Remember imperialism, fishermen can live for fish.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you for your questions, and if you have more. Thank you.